Get that kettle on.
Date of birth 15th of the 6th, 85, making me a Gemini.
Are you on drugs? Bollocks. Just tap the fucking table.
It's about time!
Kat Slater, Alison Hammond and my mum's mate Adele, they all have one thing in common. They're what some of us would call Huns. In this episode of You Alright Hun, we're going to talk about what a Hun is, where they've come from, and how they are a distinctly British institution. So, welcome to the first ever episode of You Alright Hun. This podcast, as I said a minute ago, is just going to focus on introducing us to the woman that is the Hun. What is a Hun? Where did she come from? Why do we love them so much? So to start off, over the last couple of years really, Instagram accounts like Love of Huns and Hunsnet have really exploded in popularity. They post photos, videos and general memes featuring women that we all know and mostly love from distinctly British pop culture. So think clips of Gillian McKeith passing out when I'm a celeb with the caption, "Me leaving a bottomless brunch, kiss," or like early 2000s pictures of Martine McCutcheon doing her weekly shop. Love of Huns in particular has been going since about 2017, with its popularity skyrocketing during the peak of the COVID pandemic, but the actual idea of the Hun has been around for years, in different forms perhaps, but she's always been here. So what exactly is a Hun in today's day and age? According to the Cambridge Dictionary, the definition of Hun is the short form of honey, a way of speaking to someone that you like or love, or someone who you want to be friendly to. I think that this is a really good starting point, maybe like a good surface level description. Like, we all have our own Huns, we all have our own friends that we love, but I think there are many more layers to the capital H Huns with a kiss, and a long history that has moulded them into the women that we know today. So like, what is it? What makes a Hun with a kiss? There is something else I've not mentioned yet that is specific to Hun culture. It's pretty camp. So to explain this idea to you lot, I had to research what it really means to be camp, and I had to figure out how that ties into British Hun culture. The term camp is thought to have originated from the French slang term "se camper," which I probably absolutely butchered just then, which roughly means to posture or behave extravagantly. It also is thought to potentially have come from a Polari word, which was a secret coded language used by gay men in the 50s and 60s, and that word was camp but with a K, and that was the term for a male prostitute. So all in all, camp has always been seen as a little bit fruity. Over time, the word camp grew to mean, and I am quoting here, an aesthetic in which something has appeal because of its bad taste or ironic value. This definition, I would argue, was best put across, best described, best explained by Susan Sontag in her 1964 essay, Notes on Camp. So Sontag's essay is now seen as capital T, the capital D definition of camp. The 2019 Met Gala theme was Camp, Notes on Fashion, and it was built entirely around the essay, and was presided over by perhaps the American queen of camp herself, Lady Gaga. I do feel like I've been talking a lot about camp and not nearly enough about Huns, so let's move on. So, to understand the Hun, we have to understand how she fits into the idea of campness. The main takeaway from Notes on Camp, for me, was that camp wasn't necessarily an idea, it's more of a state of being. It's also almost impossible to be camp on purpose. Huns, as well as campness, as an idea and philosophy, are over the top and exaggerated, yet real. They're a joke, yet they're seriously self-aware. They have an air of that if you know, you either get it or you don't get it. They're out of date, but in a great way, in an amazingly nostalgic way. Jack Remington, who was an X Factor contestant and self-proclaimed Hun lover, has stated in a GQ article, UK Hun, introducing a very British subculture, that Huns are, and I'm quoting here again, the women who we grew up watching on TV, or celebrities who were famous at that time, as well as women who perhaps remind us of our mums, or of the quirky teachers at school who might have known that we were gay and were supportive of us. I think that he's encapsulated perfectly how the average lover of Huns has grown up with Huns, so we just know who they are and what they're like. Huns are comforting and nostalgic and inclusive. The Hun works with the idea of camp because the Hun is the exaggerated version of a woman that we all know, and one of the main bullet points of camp put across by Sontag is that it is the love of the exaggerated, the off, of things being what they are not. I guess the other half of that quote works too, things being what they are not. We all know that Lisa Scott-Lee was not a top 10 recording artist, even though she tried her hardest. Is that too mean? Okay, anyway, as I was saying, Huns are over the top and they always have been, but they don't try to be, they just are. This is another point in Sontag's essay. You cannot force campness, as that will lead to whatever you're trying to make to just be capital B bad. We look back at some of the things that our beloved Huns did in their primes. Davina McCall asking us with increased frenzy if we fancied another one, or Kat Slater proclaiming that she didn't just become a little bit of a slag, she became a total slag. And think, God, I can't believe that was serious. But the whole point of Hun culture is that it was serious, yet it is still so unserious. Huns and Hun adjacent people know that they can take the piss out of themselves and become the larger than life versions of themselves, yet still be so real. Sontag also states that not everything that could be camp is actually camp. And another quote here, natural oddities, products of immense labour, they lack the visual reward, the glamour, the theatricality that marks off certain extravagances as camp. This exclusivity of camp translates to the fact that Huns are effortlessly who they are. You cannot force your way into Hunship. There is also kind of the paradox of Huns being both exclusive and inclusive and very niche yet widely known and understood. Huns are somehow an inside joke that we all know and love. Hun culture is also somehow so distinctly and specifically British and almost too specific to be understood by most people. Yet the accounts Love of Huns and Hunsnet have a combined 781,000 followers on Instagram. Only British people would understand why a photo shoot of Sophie Ellis-Bextor sat atop a massive tin of Heinz 5 beans is inherently hilarious and camp. Remember the poor taste, ironic value definition. Despite the Hun phenomenon being distinctly British, it could be argued that some American icons can be classified as a Hun. Honorary Hunship, we might say. Huns celebrate all who are camp and held in high regard by the Hun fan base. For example, Love of Huns celebrated Britney Spears' freedom from her 13-year-long conservatorship, alongside Paris Hilton's wedding and Lindsay Lohan's long-awaited return to acting. Despite not being British, these women have that certain, almost inexplainable something that grants them the Hun support. So, when we're talking about Huns and where they came from, I need to talk about something else that isn't just campness. We also need to dive into the history of the Hun to see where she evolved from and how different kinds of subcultures and ideas about women through the ages have contributed to the Hun that we have today. My research for this podcast took me to several different What Are Huns articles, which in turn introduced me to the ladette. So I guess now we're going to have to talk about what is a ladette and how did she lay the groundwork for the Huns of today. So earlier we had a Cambridge definition and now we've got an Oxford Languages definition. So the Oxford Languages definition of ladette is a young woman who behaves in a boisterously assertive or crude manner and engages in heavy drinking sessions. A relatable Hun then. According to Louise Donovan's 2017 Vice article, The Rise and Fall of the Ladette, during the 70s and 80s, much was achieved in the way of breaking down gender stereotypes, and the ladette was a product of women's increased equality. Basically, ladettes were rejecting traditional gender roles. They would act like the men in their lives and more, drink them under the table, be even louder and rowdier. Professor Angela Smith from Sunderland University wrote in her book Naked Exhibitionism, Gender and Public Performance, that the ladette liberated young women from the confines of a very conservative form of femininity because they could behave just like men. All in all, ladettism was a form of feminism. Some notable ladettes that are still around today, albeit not rolling out of the Met Bar with their left tit out, are Sarah Cox, Denise Van Outen and Zoe Ball, who are all comfortably sat in the pantheon of Huns today, I think. I also found another academic essay, woo, as part of the research, which is called Ladettes and Modern Girls, Troublesome Young Femininities, by Dr. Carolyn Jackson and Dr. Penny Tinkler. That is an iconic name if you ask me. This pair are definitely Huns. This article or essay, or whatever you want to call it, was really interesting. It essentially took the timeline back further, explaining how Ladettes were an evolution from the modern girls of the 1920s. Modern girls are also known as flappers, and were predominantly white, single, young, urban women aged 16 to 30 years old, usually upper or middle class, according to the essay. This essay really drives home the point that both Ladettes and modern girls were primarily interested in hedonism, seeking out fun and the pursuit of pleasure. This sentence, I think, perfectly captures how the Ladette and the Hun are intrinsically linked. They are both women or general icons that exist almost purely to have fun. Like I said earlier, Huns know how to take the piss out of themselves. The final point that I want to talk about in this episode of You're Right Hun is how the Hun is an accepting, relatable, inclusive and diverse subculture. Despite the odd specificity of British Hun humour, the Hun isn't specific with who can engage with it, unlike other aspects of British culture, Tory sleaze, general racism veiled as patriotism, etc, etc. I think Jackie Adedeji illustrated this point perfectly in her August 2021 article for Metro News, Hun Culture Has Become a Safe Space for Me as a Black Woman. In this article, Jackie talks about how black women have always had to work twice as hard to get to certain places. She refers to Judy Love and Alison Hammond in this piece, and those are two iconic Huns. But she also says that being a Hun has allowed for her to find a space where she could just be relaxed and light-hearted. Jackie discusses how Hun culture and humour is massively influenced by the nostalgia of the early noughties. I'm quoting here. Wearing Dream Matte Mousse foundation and fake Ugg boots, taking your PE kit to school in a Jane Norman carrier bag, and spritzing celebrity fragrances. Colleen X was a favourite. And also having to decide whether to vote for Will Young or Gareth Gates in the Pop Idol final, and Gareth should have won. And so, thinking about that, this wide-reaching nostalgia is what makes the Hun for everyone. I think I'll sign off from this episode with a little quote from Jackie. Her words exactly are, "This is why Hun culture has become a safe space for us. It's somewhere we can be light-hearted and free. It's somewhere that everyone, no matter what creed or colour, is welcome."